Hello everyone, we hope you are doing well. We are the group assigned in other topics, and I am Jam Labong, and I will be summarizing the discussion thread we had for this week. And together with me is Ernacio, who will also be presenting on the relevance of the readings with a class discussion on the discussion thread. But before we proceed to the discussion proper, I want us to ponder on these questions. Are we responsible for the injustices in our society? How do we know if we are to be responsible or accountable? What does our current situation tell us about our moral obligation? Or whether or not countries have obligation to other countries? Would we be really able to achieve total justice? Or will it remain a utopian ideal? So without further ado, we go now to the first out of the 5 questions in the discussion thread. So for the first question, this is about institutions and injustices. So the question goes like this. Are there instances when institutions actually perpetuate existing injustices? And the following themes and points that have been derived from this discussion are the following. So, one instance that actually perpetuated the injustices we know of today is, according to the respondent, is the implementation of the death penalty in many countries. So, in the discussion, the implementation of the death penalty was deemed counterproductive, as it didn't really stop crimes, or it just doesn't stop crimes, or it doesn't eradicate it. It did instill fear, it does instill fear, but it showed for the respondent no deterrent effect. So defeats its purpose. So another general point or instance in the discussion was the appeal to corporations and those with power. We could say that this is a repercussion of what we call the neoliberalism. So, and of course, we have weaponization of information, we have historical distortions. Usually, this is used to spread propaganda, and of course, we have also the rampant culture of impunity in the Philippines. Here we have we see government leniency towards people who commit the crime. We have unlawful killings. We have those rich people, or those people with power who are able to avoid the consequences of their crimes, for example. And yeah, those things. And others include the uncareful framing of the media. We have rampant corruption, for example, the martial law, Bureau of Customs, and of course we have corruptions during the Typhoon Ondoy, and etc. So to conclude the first question, or the first discussion, this is our thesis statement. Many prevalent institutions and institutionalizations, namely the government, enforcement of laws, and the culture of impunity, among others, exacerbate pre-existing injustices. And for that, we thank the following respondents. So we proceed now to the second question. This is about foreign aid and moral responsibility in international relations in general. So the question is, do you think rich countries have a moral obligation, for example, to donate their vaccines to poorer nations? And these we have respondents saying that it could be an example of realism. In the case that countries don't possess such obligation. So there's what the respondent called the security dilemma. And we have also liberal international regime and this sense of cooperation in terms of moral obligation. We also have common humanity, utilitarianism, and obligation. Richer countries who are doing well are actually obliged to ensure that the poorer countries are also ensured and promoted. So this comes from the adage, ensuring rights of everyone. So basically everyone. Richer countries have the responsibility to provide for those who cannot provide for their own vaccines. And so we can also root the responsibility of these richer countries or any other countries in the globe, around the globe, from the colonization and exploitation of poorer countries. So basically, these countries have the responsibility to actually help these countries whom they have exploited, especially during Second World War or World War. So yeah, so there's this colonial extraction of resources. So basically, they have the responsibility to do something for them, forwarding global solutions in terms of making use of these international organizations, because we're living in the period of globalization. It is naturally constantly rely on other countries to help us, like for example loans, etc. So we have the responsibility beyond borders, of course. So our duties, the country's duties are not anymore constrained in their its own constituents or citizens, especially for those richer countries or progress countries. So there's also incentives when it comes to helping other countries as well. So if it would benefit the country, of course, there's 100% motivation to actually help the poorer countries. So to end the second discussion, this is our thesis statement. Richer countries have the moral obligation to aid poorer countries in procuring vaccines motivated by the incentive of a global normal functioning to sustain globalized ideals. And for that, we thank the following respondents. Now we proceed to the third discussion or question. This is about structural injustice and anarchy. The question was given by Miss Karen Rosales. Given that some governments do allow and or perpetuate structural injustices, can you imagine yourself advocating anarchy? We have respondents saying that the flaws of institutions can't be easily resolved by simply advocating for anarchy, because anarchy can also be chaos. In that sense, because there are no limitations. So what comes out in these reasons is that lawless societies are actually undesirable. And for other respondents, this attribution is prescriptive. Also, we could also fix and change structures instead of choosing to be completely lawless. So anarchy would perpetuate injustices even more because of societies not having any limitation at all. So this is actually a weak alternative for these structures that we have right now. So it's not really a proper solution. The thesis statement is, resorting to a lawless society cannot fully remedy the present form of government institutions that perpetuate social injustices. For that, we thank the following respondents for the third discussion thread. So the fourth question comes from Daniel Quilantang. How do you think global justice can be attained in a world polarized by political ideologies, economic competition, and social divisions? So the following points have been extracted. So first, ideologies have the same foundations, no matter how diverse, according to sub-respondents. So this means that there are organizations that have been formed in order to forward the same advocacies. For example, basic human rights, advocating for the rights of women, advocating for the rights of the LGBTQ plus community, and of course, basically to maintain peace, order, and relations. For example, we have the International Court, the ICC. So, well, we cannot deny that differences do deprive us of actually attaining that utopian goal, that utopian society that we've been longing for centuries now. So, but we also cannot deny that differences allowed us to actually progress. So right now we come to an understanding that these different political ideologies that we have right now are actually inevitable for a society to progress. We also have the concept of pluralism, where we have or we allow different political ideologies to coexist with one another, just so we could have need right now is to make these mediators efficient and to really serve their purpose for an international discussion, for an effective resource distribution, etc. Our thesis statement for this fourth discussion is: attaining global justice during a time of difference requires mediation embodied through international dialogues, organizations, and courts. So, for that, we thank these respondents for answering and contributing to the questions. For the fifth and last question, this is from Joseph Gonzalez. The COVAX facility, in its current capacity, is able to fully bridge the vaccine inequality gap between the two types of countries, rich and poor? If not, what else is needed for the COVAX facility to work as intended? So these are the points that we got from the discussion thread. So we have limitations in COVAX. So, for example, we have the biggest benefactors, or those who actually contributed a lot to the vaccine procurement, are still being prioritized. According to some respondents, there should be a lessening of priority or prioritization, especially for those VIPs who, for example, are the first order takers, the first bidders, the biggest benefactors. So, richer countries have the obligation to give way to these poorer countries to have access to it. Because a respondent said that they owe it to us for being colonized and exploited. So, adequacy could be a form of inequality, or it is a form of inequality now, if it continues to be that way. So, it needs to be fixed right away. So, because the COVAX's priority should be on the poorer countries. So we have to be able to lessen the inequality right now for us to really regulate the vaccine distribution. And also for us to really advocate for the proper funding of the COVAX facilities in order for its intention to really go around the world and really help the countries that are really in need right now. So for that, the thesis statement is: the COVAX facility does provide vaccines to poorer countries, but it is still lacking in terms of the inequalities in the system that needed to be addressed in order for it to fully serve its purpose. For that, we thank the following respondents. Without further ado, we continue on to the relation of the discussion to the readings. This would be reported by Ian.
Thank you, Jam, for the summary of the thread. Now, in relation to the readings, the first reading we want to relate the questions to would be Political Responsibility and Structural Injustices by Iris Young. And before we can tackle the question of, say, structural injustices and political responsibility, what Iris Young does first is to discuss precisely how we understand these institutions. So, from a Rawlsian sense, institutions and social institutions are understood as state institutions, as collectives that have responsibility to distribute rights, duties, foster social cooperation, and make the mobilization of resources possible and foster such, and defend individual actions and enact collective consequences when necessary. And to add on to that, the way Peter Blau interprets these institutions is that he understands these structures as a matter of social positions. So say how one person is different from the other person, and the dynamic in between that goes on between these two people. In that sense, we can understand that the space of structures, of social structures, is an ambiguous space, always molded and always dynamic relative to the relation of the individuals within it. Uh, and to add on to that, we need to understand then that in these social positions, when we understand how these institutions, how these organizations, how these positions are in ways formalized, we look at it from the perspective of Sartre and Giddens, a kind of twofold interpretation, twofold extension, as it were. The way Giddens understands it is these institutions and these social dynamics and these social conditions and injustices are caused by how the people within these institutions act in accordance to, say, the rules and by the social norms. So, say, the way we act is in accordance to the social norms. But because collectively there is this consensus that we must act upon these social norms, otherwise, we must face the consequence of, say, things that are illegal or things that are otherwise unsavory, we perpetuate we perpetuate the realization of these social norms and social rules. And it's especially all the worse when these social norms and these social rules are prejudiced against, say, minorities, or prejudiced against the indigent, or what have you. And Sartre says that, we cannot just simply see these institutions as always merely a collective of these individual actions. Of course, it's not to say merely as in it's not profound, but we must also take into account, Sartre would add, the historical influences that have led us to this position, and the historical consequences that our position in perpetuating these these position and these consequences would have in the future. And so what does that then speak of the con of what doesn't that speak of institutional and social injustices? Well, as mentioned in the discussion thread, many prevalent institutions and institutionalizations, namely the government, enforcement of laws, and the culture of impunity, among others, exacerbate these pre-existing injustices. And I think that statement is a very succinct way of describing the dynamic upon which these institutions are not only formed but are also realized and perpetuated, and all such justices and injustices that come along with it. Now the question becomes, say, on the matter of the participation of people, because if these institutions are very much but trying to avoid reification, constituted by people, motivated by people, and perpetuated by people, what then are people to do in light of these injustices? And here we tackle the notion of political responsibility and its distinction from the liability model of responsibility. We have to understand that, say, namely, the difference comes in the matters of actions and your connection as a person, your responsibility towards this specific actions that, say, you have just witnessed. And we can all agree that when we witness social injustices going on, it is not to say that it is our fault that these injustices are taking place. But it's also a matter that you as a citizen, you as a citizen within the society that injustice is taking place, perhaps you have a responsibility in that aspect. And that's where the question of agents and actions come from. But then how how does that differ from the liability model of responsibility? Well, the liability model of responsibility uh, understands this dynamic in such a way that the agent's action and outcomes uh, must be directly tied to the action itself. So say, you know, you're walking by and you bump into someone, and as a result of you bumping into somebody, their lunch falls over. You know, perhaps loosely, we can say that you have a responsibility if you were, say, looking at your phone, if you were acting carelessly, that you might need to compensate this person's lunch. And in a way, that's how the liability model of responsibility works, in that you have an action and then you have the act, yeah, you have the moral actors, and they are in charge and they have responsibility primarily of remedying that specific instance. However, political responsibility differs in such a way by taking an Arendtian approach on political responsibility, in how Arendt understands political responsibility as politics being the culmination of people's actions and their movements in and how they affect the consequent movements of these institutions, and how these consequent movements of institutions inevitably come back to the people. And in this sense, we realize that there are the two different dynamics of uh, political responsibility and individual responsibility is that political responsibility is a forward-looking model, where as opposed to the backwards-looking model of the liability model. And that's not to say that we should ditch the liability model in favor of the political responsibility model, because both are very much necessary. Uh, However, there is this aspect of political responsibility that leaves this space of ambiguity, the space of political responsibility that leaves the matter of how one can resolve social injustice or structural injustice uh, to a matter of relativity and subjectivity. And the question of relativity is relative to what? Well, we look at the context of, say, connection, power, and privilege. Say you see a homeless person, and this homeless person starts begging you for food or money, as it were. See, the idea is that from a liability model, we do not have this. We don't have. You don't have. You're not liable for this person's condition, but you also understand that their homelessness could be a result of many social factors that have contributed to, say, the difficulty in finding a job, or, say, being put out of work because of COVID-19, because of factors out of their control, etc., etc. And you, as a citizen, of course, you can, say, give money, but a person in a position of wealth, or in a position of where they have a lot of connections, can take the responsibility to such a way that they create a humanitarian organization that seeks to uh, provide provide further welfare, provide further support and assistance to people in need. And it's not to say that, unlike a liability model of responsibility, where perhaps state institutions are allowed to enforce the specific ways upon which one can enact these responsibilities, there is this privatization of responsibility that occurs in political responsibility. It is both a privatization, but it is a shared privatization. In such, if this to use the two words somewhat loosely, as opposed to a collective responsibility, say in the case of a state entity, or in the case of, say, a corrupt charity, or in the case of a company upon which responsibility falls collectively on them. That's collective, not shared. And of course, here we come into the question of, say, the question of anarchy, of can if these state institutions do perpetuate injustices, must we move to anarchy? I say no. And I would like to go around the common notion that anarchy is a chaotic rule, somewhat of a Mad Max situation, and just merely anarchy in its main principal ideals that respects individual liberty and respects, say, the autonomy of individuals and groups of individuals to act without, say, the state being involved. Uh, and I think the opinion of Anarchy from the discussion thread is that resorting to lawless society cannot fully remedy the present form of government institution that perpetuates social injustices. And yes, that is completely correct because to some extent, to some extent, um, to some extent, in order to remedy these structural injustices, it is not. We must recognize that by removing state structures, it does not necessarily mean that these injustices are to dissolve into the ether. No, these injustices exist. And yes, state institutions do perpetuate them, but you also understand that state institutions also play a role in trying to remedy these. And what I think exists primarily should be a balance between personal responsibility in our individual autonomy and individual sense of what is ethical to in our own ways, remedy the injustice that we see around us, but also we must collectively move as a political unit in a collective ambition to further, the ambitions of our state institutions or to seek justice where is necessary. Because ultimately, say the question of say because the unanarchist question of say taxes, of a shared um, social obligation to pay your taxes do contribute to the provision of welfare, to the provision of social support nets, to the provision of healthcare, to many others. And the next reading to tackle would be humanity and justice in the global perspective. Uh, so at the start of the paper, uh, we talk about Peter Singer's question on humanity and primarily uh, the case of the drowning child and how it relates to foreign aid. Namely, the question of the drowning child talks about if you see a drowning child and you are in a position to save it, albeit at a great inconvenience, at a great personal cost, should you save the drowning child? And the question, as Singer put, would be yes. If you are in a position to save the child, then you have responsibility to save the child because because the sacrifices undertaken does not outweigh the moral value of the preservation of life. And of course, in the case of because in the case of foreign aid, we can extend that, especially in the case of COVID, wherein it is not quite simply that these it is not quite simply that these third world countries or countries that are in need of aid, in need of help, are can be left merely to their own devices that we can give them 30 years to fix the problem. No, because a crisis such as, a pandemic is immediate in that if we don't solve it right away, millions of lives are very much at stake. And the question then becomes, do rich countries have this moral obligation to provide aid for poorer countries? And I think the question here is it a moral obligation rather than simply a means of, is it noble, is it good? And here we understand the case of justice and humanity. Later on in the paper, it is discussed that the question of justice and humanity in the context of the provision of foreign aid comes down namely to this, in that it is it is an entailment of one and the other, in that humanity is an aspirational endeavor to pursue and to attain and to aspire towards a state of well-being, the state of well-being. Whereas justice, on the other hand, comes down to the question on the allocation of resources. And here, you know, we have the questions of compensation, responsibility, and redistribution, because the question of whether or not it is a moral obligation is more than just a matter of whether it is charity or whether we must appeal to to a sense of common humanity, which I think I still agree we should, but also a matter of if one were to provide justice, if one were to defend justice and understand the allocation of resources, is it not unjust if, say, one person or if several or if a small group of countries who have the economic ability to produce and outsource these vaccines not provide these vaccines at all when the case is a global concern? And especially in the case of humanity, is it not then the case of humanity that, in the pursuit of well-being comes the minimization of harm? So that's where the thesis statement of richer countries have the moral obligation to aid poor countries in procuring vaccines, motivated by the incentive of a global normal functioning to sustain globalized ideals. And here this is where we have the question of whether it is an aspiration, whether or not, to what extent is this an aspirational endeavor, and to what aspect should this be a normative endeavor? And of course, that harkens back to the previous readings, but I will leave the connection of those two papers to you guys. So, sorry. And finally, the last question. Finally, the last question of the discussion thread is on the matter of is in the matter of uh, whether or not this global justice in a time of indifference requires mediation embodied through, uh, despite whether or not global justice is possible, despite political ideals, despite political differences and dialogues and so on and so forth. And the collective statement would be, attaining global justice in a time of difference requires mediation embodied through international dialogues, organizations, and courts. And yes, very much so, because in the context of trying to achieve, say, a global justice upon which the allocation and reallocation of resources follows a sense of moral good, is understandably a utopian ideal, to put it at such a scale. But at the same time, we also have to remember that just because we also have to remember that the question of achieving that globalized ideal matters insofar as the way to get there must also be uh, morally good as well. It is not the question of whether or not, do the ends justify the means. If the in the context of dialogue, we're able to avoid the common pitfalls of redistribution, such as, say, third world countries rightfully being skeptical of being provided to by a wealthy country, seeing it as a potential for perhaps an extended imperialism. And in such a way, the attempt to reach this utopian ideal must come at each step must come at each step respecting a certain degree of autonomy of the people involved, when the utopian ideal is very much a radical systematic change. And that is currently what is being done now. In many cases, that the distribution and redistribution of resources, especially of foreign aid, is very much always to the question and always very much to the discretion of international organizations and their state representatives. And I think that for us to get to that state of a pure utopian ideal, we must also very much respect that progress comes often incrementally. Very rarely does it and can it happen radically. But progress does happen, especially in the case of the creation of the COVAX and the redistribution of vaccines, despite all the questions of the privatization of vaccines and the matter of patents. But at the same time, it is in understanding, it is understanding this progress that we are also wary of the times that we do not progress and do take a step backwards. And I think this is a good place to end off, because I know there are a lot more questions, but I feel as if the questions are better left. The rest of the questions are better left to you guys. Thank you all for listening.